Western political discourse has undergone a profound mutation. What still calls itself progressive is no longer classical liberalism in the 20th century sense, but a broad ideological coalition composed of identity politics, woke activism, anti-colonial frameworks, institutional media culture, LGBT-aligned activism, and a post-1991 anti-conservative realignment. This new bloc does not merely oppose specific policies. It increasingly seeks to redefine the moral architecture of Western politics itself. Pre-1991 conservative traditions, Reagan-era republicanism, Bush-era geopolitics, national sovereignty, security-first doctrines, and Cold War patriotism are often reframed within this new moral order not simply as outdated, but as structurally oppressive. Donald Trump becomes less an individual political figure than a symbolic vessel onto which broader anxieties about nationalism, borders, sovereignty, and civilizational continuity are projected. The target is not merely a politician, but an entire historical framework associated with older Western conservatism. Yet this transformation cannot be understood purely through conventional political analysis. It is also psychological, technological, and civilizational. Eric Hoffer anticipated the emotional mechanics decades ago. His thesis was that mass movements are driven less by coherent ideology than by the psychological hunger for belonging, meaning, moral certainty, and collective identity. Individuals alienated from stability or purpose often dissolve themselves into emotionally charged causes larger than themselves. Social media has industrialized this process. Millions now participate in permanent digital mass movements where outrage functions as identity and moral participation, becomes a substitute for historical understanding. The emotional atmosphere increasingly resembles what Hoffer described in revolutionary or religious movements. Collective moral fervor fused with the desire to belong to a righteous historical mission. This dynamic often resembles the crusade of the poor, not because the ideologies are identical, but because the psychological structure is similar. Symbolism overwhelms complexity, emotional belonging overrides historical nuance, and mass participation becomes self-reinforcing through spectacle and moral absolutism. Marshall McLuhan helps explain why this escalation accelerated so rapidly. His thesis, "The medium is the message," argued that communication systems reshape human consciousness independently of ideological content. Social media does not merely transmit political opinions, it restructures cognition itself around immediacy, outrage, tribal signaling, emotional reaction, and symbolic performance. In the digital environment, conflict becomes spectacle, and algorithms reward the loudest emotional extremes rather than nuance or historical depth. Millions become participants in a permanent psychological battlefield where visibility itself becomes power. Within this environment, Western progressive activism, woke, LGBT-aligned, anti-racist, anti-colonial, sometimes unintentionally amplifies narratives originating from Islamist movements, even when those movements fundamentally reject progressive values themselves. Organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and the Houthis have committed mass violence, repression, sectarian brutality, misogyny, and persecution of LGBT individuals. Yet in the symbolic grammar of many Western activist spaces, moral legitimacy increasingly flows toward whoever occupies the role of the oppressed. René Girard explains this through his theory of mimetic conflict. Girard argued that human beings imitate not only desires but enemies. Rival groups gradually become mirror images of one another while competing for moral innocence and victimhood status. Modern political struggle increasingly revolves around symbolic suffering because victimhood has become the primary currency of moral legitimacy. Every faction seeks recognition as historically persecuted while portraying opponents as uniquely oppressive. Islamist propaganda weaponizes this mechanism effectively by framing geopolitical conflict, primarily through images of suffering capable of triggering emotional identification in Western audiences already conditioned by oppression-based moral frameworks. Meanwhile, Israelis inhabit an entirely different psychological universe. For many Israelis, especially after the conflict is interpreted through existential insecurity, historical trauma, collective memory, and survival consciousness shaped by centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust. October 7 was experienced not merely as terrorism, but as a modern pogrom and civilizational rupture. When activists relativize, deny, aestheticize, or reinterpret that trauma through abstract ideological frameworks, many Israelis perceive not criticism, but the implicit message that Jewish suffering is negotiable and Jewish existence conditional. Here Jonathan Haidt becomes important. Haidt argues that political tribes operate through different moral foundations. Progressive movements tend to emphasize care, equality, anti-oppression, and protection of marginalized groups. Conservatives place greater emphasis on loyalty, continuity, authority, cohesion, and security. Israelis after October 7 often speak the language of survival and existential defense. Western progressive activists often speak the language of asymmetrical power and anti-colonial justice. Islamist movements speak the language of sacred resistance and destiny. These are not merely competing opinions. They are incompatible moral grammars. Each side experiences the other as morally incomprehensible. Hannah Arendt warned that ideological systems become dangerous when they totalize reality into one all-explaining moral framework. Under ideological totalization, ambiguity disappears and all events become absorbed into a single narrative structure. Oppressor versus oppressed, colonizer versus colonized, fascist versus anti-fascist, reactionary versus progressive. Complexity becomes morally suspicious because it disrupts the coherence of the ideological story. In such an atmosphere, historical suffering that does not fit the dominant framework, whether Jewish, Armenian, Kurdish, or otherwise, can become selectively minimized, reframed, or subordinated to contemporary moral hierarchies. This is why the informational battlefield increasingly feels detached from objective reality. Legacy media amplifies emotional extremes because outrage drives engagement. Social platforms reward spectacle over accuracy. Governments exploit chaos for strategic leverage. Activists moralize geopolitics into symbolic theater. Islamist propaganda weaponizes victimhood imagery. Nationalist movements respond with securitized existential narratives. Every actor participates in feedback loops that intensify polarization. Carl Schmitt predicted something similar through his thesis that politics ultimately reduces to the distinction between friend and enemy. Liberal societies imagine politics can remain procedural and rational indefinitely, but Schmitt argued that existential antagonism always returns. In today's environment, political opponents are increasingly treated not as rivals, but as illegitimate threats to civilization itself. Conservatives portray progressives as civilizational saboteurs. Progressives portray conservatives as proto-authoritarian dangers. Islamists portray secular modernity as corruption. Nationalists portray globalization as dissolution. Once politics becomes existential, compromise itself appears immoral because the enemy is no longer simply wrong but fundamentally illegitimate. The result is a collision of incompatible realities. Israelis speak the language of survival. Woke and LGBT-aligned activists speak the language of oppression hierarchies and moral recognition. Post-1991, progressives speak the language of anti-conservative revisionism. Islamist movements speak the language of sacred destiny and resistance. Social media speaks the language of spectacle, emotional velocity, and hysteria. Governments speak the language of strategic leverage. These languages cannot fully translate into one another. Each side, therefore, interprets the others not merely as mistaken, but as malicious, deceptive, or morally corrupt. At this point, modern politics begins to resemble what could be called competing secular monotheisms. Your truth becomes absolute truth. Your suffering becomes uniquely sacred. Your enemies become metaphysical enemies. Instead of ending, my God versus your God, modernity multiplied it into ideological, political, digital, and tribal absolutisms. Woke ideology, political Islam, nationalist populism, online tribalism, and media-driven identity politics increasingly behave like rival monopolies on moral truth. And so the mind game continues. Whenever media systems lose narrative control, older archetypes quickly re-emerge, among them the reflexive invocation of the Zionists as hidden orchestrators of events. This reveals how deeply conspiratorial and symbolic thinking still permeates modern political consciousness, especially during periods of social fragmentation and informational overload. The tragedy is that peace becomes nearly impossible once every faction believes itself uniquely righteous, uniquely victimized, and uniquely authorized to define moral reality for everyone else. Some people still seek genuine peace. Many seek victory, validation, or emotional belonging instead. And in a global civilization increasingly governed by outrage algorithms, ideological absolutism, and perpetual psychological mobilization, in the elite technological and philosophical mist of an untold war of silence, targeting the conscious unconscious, the loudest voices are often those who benefit most from endless conflict.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, neath the halo of a street lamp. I turned my collar to the cold and damp, when my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs and voices never shared, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach. of silence.